You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Gearcast. This week has been Macro Week at B&H Photo, and if you've been following B&H Explora, you've no doubt noticed we've published a dozen brand spanking new articles about macro photography and macro-related gear. If you haven't seen it yet, head on over. In today's podcast, John Harris and I welcome photographer Marc Silber. Marc's new book is called Advancing Your Photography, and it's a terrific book about every aspect of photography based on Marc's experiences and the experiences of other working pros. Marc's photographic foundation is film-based, and like John and I, he's since gone full-tilt digital. Marc will be filling us in on the details of his book, as well as tossing in his 2 cents worth during our discussion about macro photography. Before we begin, if you're still not a subscriber to our show, head on over to iTunes and sign up. It's absolutely free. And don't forget to check out our podcast landing page on the B&H Explora website. Every episode can be found on our site along with background text, photos, and other visual treats you can't see in an audio podcast. All right, and now a segment that we know you're all waiting for. It's time for Al's Gearhead Pick of the Week. Okay. If you reside on the other side of the bridge and you know who I'm referring to, and if you think strutting around with an old film camera around your neck is cool, maybe it's time you took your act to the next level by making your own photo books. And I don't mean print-on-demand photo books. I mean pot of glue, needle and thread, handmade types of books. You can now special order all of the tools and materials you need to hand assemble your very own limited edition books from Lineco. It sounds like Remco or one of those, it slices it dices, but it's Lineco, Lineco. You supply the words and pictures, and Lineco can supply you with bookbinding and book repair toolkits, gluing kits, cover fabrics, spools of waxed linen thread, natural black and brown, and curved sewing needles. Like I said, if you want to really make a photo book, just go to our website and put Lineco into the search box, and there you have it. Lineco. Okay, now on with our show. An outdoors photographer and educator, Marc Silber has been teaching photo and mountaineering skills for many years, including a stint at Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, of which our very own John Harris is a graduate. In fact, he's wearing his graduation skirt today in honor of the event. A nice little tassel on the epaulets. You look really good today, let me tell you. Anyway, Marc is perhaps best known for his highly popular YouTube show called Advancing Your Photography, which has won several Telly Awards and is a prime destination for photographers of all stripes looking for pro tips, wisdom, and inspiration. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Al. Good to be here.
Nice to have you. Tell us about the book.
Okay, well, the book was an outgrowth of these over 1,000 hours of interviews I've done with a whole host of different photographers.
Go ahead. Tell us.
Name dropping.
Started
with Chase Jarvis up in Seattle. Chase introduced me to a bunch of other guys, David Hobby, Joe McNally. We just took it from there. And I started collecting interviews with any photographer who was really excellent in their genre.
And you had this book in mind when you were doing these, or was it just let me start doing this and see where it goes?
Well, in the back of my mind, I thought, someday I've got to turn this into a book.
Okay.
But I created these shows. We have over 300 interviews on the website. We have over 300 interviews on YouTube. And at some point, about 2014, I thought, I've got to turn this into a book. Videos are great, but you can't carry them around in your pocket. Mm-hmm. You can't make little notes in them, There's something about a physical book that it's a handbook that's the size that you can carry in your camera bag. And you know what it is a complete system of photography. That was my goal.
Okay.
From beginning to end. Now, let me describe something. It took me a long time to figure this out, but I wanted to look at, is there something called the cycle of photography, which means how does it begin and how does it end? The cycle of photography has at the center of it visualization. Many great photographers, Edward Weston, Minor White, Chase Jarvis, fact, most of my guests talked about the fact that they visualize a photograph before they press the shutter, which is the difference between taking a snapshot where you're just hoping somehow or another, if you take enough of these things, one of them will stick, as opposed to the visualization is you see it in your mind's eye, then you choose the equipment, and then you figure out how to capture it, and then you press the shutter. The next thing that comes after visualization is choosing your equipment. You got to know how to use that equipment. You got to know how it works. We're going to talk about macro photography, and there's certainly specific things you want to do with macro photography that are going to be very different than shooting sports, for instance.
Sure.
Different equipment. Once you have your equipment nailed, then you capture, which is where lighting and composition and all these things that we have referred to as rules, which really are not rules. Like the rule, quote, rule of thirds, you can throw that away because it's not a rule. It's a guideline you can choose to use or not. Mm-hmm. But you still have to know these things. Otherwise, you're just kind of hoping that someone...
Learn the rules so that you can...
Yeah, I always say before you break the rules, know what they are.
You should know what they are.
Master them, and then go play.
Then you can bend them, break them or bend them, whatever you want. Then you have processing. Again, we're from the film days. After you got through shooting your roll of 36 exposures or 12 if it was a Hasselblad or whatever, you had to go in the darkroom and process those, develop them.
Do you actually talk about darkroom processing in this?
A little bit. I don't get into the details of it, but I do describe it enough so that, because I think it's important for modern photographers to understand the heritage, where we all came from.
Yeah, I think you need to know where you've been. There's something to the roots of the whole thing. By the way, you did mention about the difference between taking a picture and creating a picture.
Yes.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking, I think some of the best pictures I've ever taken after I finally got the image, I knew I got it. When I finally stood up, I realized my body's aching from craning to get into a position to get the picture I saw in my mind's eye. So that's a clue. If it hurts afterwards, you got the right. You were thinking.
I'll remember that, Al. Okay, Mike. I'll add that to the book.
Yeah, there
Uncle
you go.
Al said,
No
"Remember
pain, no
you."
gain.
Okay, if you want to slip that page into the back of all existing books,
No problem. No problem.
So the interviews you did, were they all captured on video or recorder, or a lot of them just sitting down and talking with people?
They were all videoed. We started the show in 2009. We essentially put out one every week, and it was thrilling because going out for me as a photographer and asking questions and finding out, Joe McNally, tell me about lighting, Bambi Cantrell, who's a phenomenal portrait photographer, tell me how you capture portraits. And I basically distilled many of these interviews into this book, along with my own experience, because I started taking photographs seriously when I was about 12 years old. So, I've acquired a few notches in my belt since that.
you learned a few tricks along
I've learned
the way.
a few things along the way.
Neat.
Cool. And let me ask you, is the book available outside of hard copy? Is there an ebook available? Or?
There is an ebook.
Okay.
And it's certainly available. I wrote it with hard copy in mind. Again, the size that you would carry it around.
It's a good size,
Put it in your
cool,
camera
yeah.
bag.
And it's a
Refer to
handbook,
it.
yeah.
It's a handbook.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be an intellectual experience. It's meant to be an experience that you use, you work with, you test these things out.
And who are you aiming at specifically? I mean, I'm sure anyone can get information from this. Who's your target audience?
My target audience, it's very similar to how I produce my videos. My target audience was somebody who, not a rank beginner, but somebody who said, okay, I really want to learn photography now. And I don't care if they're shooting with a smartphone. They have to have that light bulb go off. They have to think, okay, I want to become a photographer.
There's more than just tapping on the icon.
Exactly. If they haven't gotten to that point, they're probably not going to be interested in a book or advancing their gear either, because we're going to learn things and constantly be moving up in our quality. That's the person I'm looking for. And it could be a beginner who has that light bulb go off. It could be an intermediate. There's data in there that a pro will actually find useful as well.
When you were interviewing all of these photographers, did you go to them or did they come to you?
A little of both.
Okay.
I prefer to go to their studio whenever possible. But like, for instance, Joe McNally was out touring, and I caught him at one of his seminars.
Okay.
many of them I went to their studios, and I love to do that because you really get the feeling for how do they do this?
It's part of the process, the
part of the
background of it's part of the
process.
atmosphere. And if you start talking about a tool or a technique, it might just be right there, which is kind of handy.
Exactly.
Rather than doing like, shadow puppets.
Yeah, I went to Vincent Laforet, for instance. I went to his studio, and it was just interesting to see how is it set up. In many cases, they're very simple because most of these guys are shooting on location like me.
Mm-hmm.
So the studio isn't something overwhelming. It's useful and it's comfortable, but it's kind of like it demystifies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That you have to have all this equipment or this 100,000 square foot.
And you learn a lot
space.
about people when you see their spaces and how they work,
yeah.
and you see the similarities and what you can discard, what you don't need. Also,
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. So, what's your take on gear? I mean, do you? I hear you talking about using your phones, which I think obviously you can take great photos with your phones. But do you push people to buy a certain type of camera, or you're okay with whatever they use?
No, I think they should have a camera that's really going to do the job, And I started off as a Nikon guy years ago. Actually, I went through so many different phases, but shot with Nikon for many years. I switched over to Canon. I shoot with a 5D3 mostly these days. The argument between Canon and Nikon will go on forever, but make sure you have good glass for sure. And make sure you have...
Very good advice there.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day,
You're going to be upgrading your cameras much more frequently than your lenses if you buy good lenses.
Exactly. Yeah. And get equipment that's going to carry you forward so you're not having to switch out all the time. Because it takes a while to really learn a camera, and to get it to where it becomes an extension of you and your hand, it has to be intuitive like that.
But I think you also have to accept the fact that no one camera will ever be perfect.
It's true.
And once you can get that and accept it, then you just work around all the shortcomings and make whatever you need happen.
Exactly. And in post-production, we can fix a lot of those things, but not everything.
So let me ask you, what did you learn doing this book?
Ooh, that's a good question.
That's a great question.
He asks good questions.
That's
He does.
a good question, and I learned a lot. Because it's one thing to know in your own mind, this is how you do this. But when you're going to teach somebody else, and this goes back to my mountaineering instruction, you really better know what you're talking about. In mountaineering, we taught a class on rappelling, which is how you get off the mountain. It's a beautiful sunny day, the birds are chirping, the sun's out. Okay, but what if you're in the middle of a storm? As John and I know, they taught you under the conditions that could be the worst because those are where people get hurt. So you have to learn how to get off a mountain under the worst conditions. And hopefully you'll never have to use it. Well, in writing the book, I found the same thing was true. I had to drill down in many cases to find, okay, is this definition absolutely accurate? And how can I explain it in a really simple way?
Yeah.
Because that's what it takes.
Yeah, I mean, we all kind of know how to do things. And in some cases, myself, relatively self-taught, you learn how to do things in your own way, but it may not be the best way, and it certainly may not be easy to explain.
Exactly.
So,
Just like pilots, seat of your pants. That expression comes from the fact that they would actually feel the turning of the plane from the seat of their pants by their,
Yeah.
By the way, you had mentioned about with rappelling on bright sunny day. It's the same thing with photography. I mean, I always say that it's easy to take a terrific picture on a bright sunny day with blue skies and flowers and puffy clouds. But if you're on assignment it's raining outside, guess what? That's when you have to, like you said, just really dig down and go deep.
Absolutely.
And say, okay, these are my parameters. This is what I have to work with. How can I make this happen?
Bob Holmes, who's in my book, and he was a National Geographic photographer, made that point. When you're on assignment, you don't choose the weather. Mm-hmm. You don't choose whether it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon and you're going to get harsh shadows. You got to take that photograph.
That's right.
So you better learn the tricks. How do you capture a great photograph midday without harsh shadows? We talk about it in the book.
Yeah.
I like the quote you have at the table of contents from Alice in Wonderland. Begin at the beginning and go on until you come to the end. and then stop.
You know,
But that's the way the book is really kind of broken up in that way. I mean, in the order that you will be going about your work, from visualization, knowing your gear, processing, sharing.
By the way, the layout of the book, I was just flipping through it, is really well done.
Thank you.
Because a lot of books, if they're not visually presented, graphically presented, right, it's like it adds to it, just the wall there.
I know.
This book has a nice flow to it.
I have to thank my publisher, Mango, for their work on that. The quality of the layout and the printing is phenomenal. And, you know, Al, I really stressed over that because I thought, look, I'm a photographer. I have to present this material visually. It has to look good. It's like Matthew Jordan Smith, who's a celebrity photographer. He's in the book.
I know Matthew.
He's
Terrific
awesome.
guy.
Just
Yes, wonderful man.
But, you know, he says, I don't want people to just look good. I want them to feel good. And that's kind of how I wanted the book. I wanted the book to feel good as you look through it. I want it to be easy to access the information and visually look good. And by the way, John, I want to mention something else. It's true that you begin at the beginning and go through the end. But, you know, if somebody's in a hurry, in today's world, look, we're all looking for instant information. So at the end of each chapter, we wrote what's called a crash course summary, which basically summarizes everything that's in that chapter. Now, if you're on an airplane and you're about to go to Paris and you think, I want to get some quick tips on how to shoot travel photography, you can go to the section on travel photography and open that up, read those tips, and go out and use them. I'm hoping that after people do that, they'll come back to the chapter and read the whole thing. But you can access the information that way as well.
What's a punctuation point? Something I just picked up from your book here.
Punctuation point is something that Bob Holmes talks about. It's very similar to what Cartier-Bresson mentions as the decisive moment, but it's a little bit different. So as an example, here's a picture of a dance studio in Cuba, which is in there. And in the middle of it is a guy doing a dance move. I don't know if it's a pirouette or whatever, but that serves as a punctuation point, which means your eye is drawn to that little tiny thing.
The focal point.
The focal point. You know, it's termed different ways.
Yeah.
But the point is you put something there.
An anchor.
The
A visual anchor.
Your eye just goes to that first, and it makes a statement, and then you look at the rest of the photograph.
All right. We're going to take a short break and come back and talk macro.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, #BHPhotoPodcast.
Okay, and now for the GearCast topic of the day, macro photography. And let's start by defining what a macro lens is. First, I'm going to also broaden the topic. It's macro lenses and close-up because there's an overlap. And macro and close-up are not really the same thing. If you want to get technical about it, a true macro lens differs from a regular lens in that the field of focus is flat. I'll give you an example of that. If you put a camera with, say, a traditional 50 millimeter 1.4 f2, 1.4 lens, whatever, onto a camera, onto a copy stand, and you were to photograph a document or a flat piece of artwork, and you photographed it at wide aperture, if you focused in on it, the center of the image will come in sharp, but the edges will probably be a little bit soft. That's because the focus is on a curved field, not a flat field. If you do the same thing with a macro lens, as soon as the center came into focus, the corners are in focus too without having to stop down, and that's because macros have what's called a flat field of focus. That's it in a nutshell. Now, a few other differences. You can buy any lens. There are a lot of lenses that we sell, including a lot of kit lenses that come with cameras that have close focusing that will get you down real close. And by the way, macro means life size.
Yeah, that's what I thought
a
we were,
key
the
thing.
definition here. Yeah.
That's true. Now, also be aware that for the longest time, Nikon was calling all of their lenses micro lenses, which means greater than life size, but they only went to half life size. So it's been a little bit blurred, but usually micro and macro are interchangeable. But a true macro will go down to life size, sometimes half life life size and sometimes greater than that, and we'll talk about that as well.
Yeah, I think that's something we should clear up right away, is that there's this what's called true macro.
Yes.
Which is where it's a 1-to-1 ratio, where it's the exact size of what you're photographing.
Yes.
And then other lenses are called macro, and they're 1-to-2, or I think anything past that, you really can't call it macro.
By the way, you could email us if you know better.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Somebody Google this immediately.
Should get some photo experts on the show one day.
Another difference, by the way, between traditional lenses and macro lenses is that in most cases, a macro lens is sharpest at its closest focusing distance, and traditional lenses, regular lenses, are sharpest at infinity, which means you can use either one for close-up or infinity, but just be aware that if you're going to be specializing in close-up, macro will give you the very best results, and if you're going to be doing landscapes, stick to a regular lens.
Cool. All right, so anything new in the macro lens arena?
Oh, there's all kinds of stuff. Let's start talking about what is available. There's a lot of interesting lenses that have come out in the past year, and I think the widest angle macro for any of the for most consumer cameras, and that's a 15 millimeter Venus Optics Extreme Wide Angle 15 millimeter f4, which goes down to life size, and also has a shift feature on it, which means you could do a little bit of perspective correction and also play around with the plane of focus a little bit more, which is really important when you're shooting macro. And it's available for Nikon, Canon, Sony A, Sony E, and Pentax K mounts. As far as 35 millimeter full frame cameras, wide angle, you have the 15 millimeter. For normal, depending on what camera you have, everything from 45 millimeter to 65. Telephoto lenses, everything from 85 millimeter through 200. 200 millimeter is currently the longest focal length lens available in a true macro. That doesn't mean you can't get a close focusing telephoto lens, but for a true macro, that's where you're at. APS-C, wide angle, again, that 15 millimeter lens. Now it's the equivalent of a, 21 millimeter, something like that. Normals are 35 or 40, and then telephoto, you have 60, 85, 90, and that's for dedicated APS-C format macro lenses. Now, keep in mind that if you have an APS-C camera, you could put any macro lens for a full frame camera on that. So if you have a 200 millimeter or any other lens from a larger format, a full frame 35, you could pop it right on there, and again, it'll just have effectively a narrower field of view. Lastly, we have micro 4/3. Again, the widest is that 15 millimeter Venus Extreme. Now it's the equivalent of a 30. Normal lenses, there's a 30 and a 45, and these are available from Olympus and Panasonic. Telephoto, 45, 1600, depending on Panasonic or Olympus. And then again, all of the full frame and APS-C lenses you can adapt onto these cameras. So that's what you have from the manufacturers themselves.
Is that what kind of effect do you get if you put an adapter? Because you're actually pushing the lens is a little further away from the plane.
No, the adapter, if you have a mirrorless camera and you get an adapter for X brand lens, it's going to sit in the same position it did on the camera it was intended for. That's what they do. That's why every single lens adapter is a little bit different as far as the space there. So no, the way it'll behave on a larger format will be the same, just a tighter crop. By the way, if you're shooting with an APS-C format Nikon DSLR, Nikon has a neat little kit I noticed on a website. For under $500, you can get a Nikon 85 f3.5 macro lens, which goes down to 1-to-1, and a 35 f1.8 lens, which is not a real macro, but it comes in pretty close. Its focus is very close, but it's essentially an APS-C version of a nifty 50. It's like the equivalent of a 50 1.8 lens. And you get the two lenses for under $500, and that's a pretty good deal. So you could use that for portraits, and you could use that for macro stuff. That's neat. Okay, now, any questions so far? Okay, this can be a quiz.
I think I asked you this before, outside of the podcast, but is there a relationship necessarily between the minimum focus distance on a macro lens and its macro capabilities? Does that make sense? I mean,
if you have at any given focal length, the closest focusing distance determines the magnification. The closer you could focus to it, the larger it gets in your frame. And macro lenses, if you notice, you get very, very close to it. A good example, the average 50 millimeter lens, normal lens, focuses down to about 18 inches. Some go down a little bit closer, but the average one is about 1.5 feet. The average 50 millimeter, 60 millimeter macro lens focuses down to about 3.5 inches. The whole lens also, it extends greatly. There's a whole different optical formula that's being employed there. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, the closer you can focus, the greater the magnification. And again, if you have an internal focusing lens like the 180 and 200 millimeter lenses from, say, Nikon, Canon, I think Sigma, a few other companies make those. They have internal focusing, so they don't physically get larger or smaller. But a lot of the smaller focal lengths, you can see they get
they
huge.
extend. Yeah.
Specialty macro lenses. One of the wildest lenses I'd used is from Canon. It's actually been out for a while. It's called the MP-E 65 millimeter f2.8. It sells for a little over $1,000. And what's cool about this, it doesn't focus to infinity. Okay, it starts at life size, and then you focus into greater magnifications. And if you think you can handhold this thing, you're nuts. So it's a 65 millimeter lens that gets down to 5 times magnification. It's ridiculously sharp, and it's quite an amazing lens, and it's used for a lot of technical and medical purposes. But you could have fun with it, chasing ladybugs if you want.
But that's a good point you mentioned about handheld, because I've been playing with this Rokinon 100 millimeter macro lens.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Once you're down and tight and you're getting the shot you want, it's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, you're shaking, you're
Yeah.
moving. I mean, and I don't like using a tripod, but
No, for this stuff you
kinda
almost
have
have
to,
to. And I'll tell you, I've done a lot of close focus and macro work with my A7R2, and that has the 5-axis image stabilization,
stabilization,
and it really, really works. And it still does not replace a tripod at all. Especially keep in mind that the closer you get, the harder it is to frame. Did you ever try filling the frame? Did you ever try photographing a full moon with a 1,000 millimeter lens? As soon as you frame it, it moves out of the frame.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with macro.
Yeah.
It's the slightest movement. If you ever handle binoculars, you know what that magnification does. So it's really a good idea to,
or let alone
for composition and sharpness, get it on a tripod with some kind of a support.
yeah.
Right?
I mentioned that in the book as a tool to make sure you're capturing the exact same thing, and this is true with video as well, if you don't want to have an interview where the person's wiggling around,
Oh, yeah.
put it on a tripod. But the same thing is true in macro, because you're trying to really get your vision of what you want that to look like. And if you're also, it's one more thing. You're trying to keep that camera steady and make sure you got the same location, forget about
And
it.
if you have just a shallow piece in focus and you're hand holding it,
It's not.
by the time you're busy concentrating on framing the picture, you might have moved back or forth. And that happened with me yesterday. I was shooting with a 20 millimeter f2, a Rokinon lens, a new Furon lens, and I was trying to do some stuff at closest focusing distance at wide aperture. And it was tricky between holding it steady and composing it and making sure that I had just that little narrow space and focus.
Yeah. Well, I found
hard.
myself the other day with the same lens. I was shooting a detail of a brick. I mean, we're talking a really fine detail of a brick. So I got it in focus, and of course, my body moves slightly. So I'm going in and out of focus. So I basically used my own body going back and forth as the focusing mechanism, as opposed to, turning the focus.
By the way, another thing I think is a good idea, in 9 out of 10 cases, if you're using an autofocus lens, turn it off.
Absolutely.
Autofocus goes nuts at close focusing, especially, it's you can do it, but it's actually a lot easier and I think more efficient to turn it off and go in manually.
Which is one reason why a Rokinon lens, which is a manual focus lens,
Makes sense.
and you save some bucks. Yeah.
Another tip, if you're able to, tether it to your
That's a good
computer.
idea. Right.
Open it in Lightroom, which you can tether, and look at it on a big screen.
Yeah.
Because, if you're looking at it in the back of your monitor, it's one thing.
Yeah.
We're talking about a really tight focus point. When you see it on your computer screen, you can really tell whether you have it or not.
Well, I also have using the same thing on my Sony. I have a little button on top, tap it, and it blows up to 10 times and then greater. Focusing and after I go click, if I want, before I move on, I make sure I got what I left.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing, but that's also a good idea. If you're in a studio, put it onto a giant monitor, and there you go. You'll know exactly what you got.
One thing I'd maybe address maybe later or now, but with things like 5-axis image stabilization and focusing tools that modern digital cameras have, what is the effect on macro photography? Is there anything specific that you're seeing that
It's really funny because
really
we just said
macro photography better?
with all of this stuff we just said the best results, put it on a tripod and turn off your autofocus.
Or move your body back and
Or
forth.
move your
to
body.
focus.
It's literally, it has to be hands-on manual. I would say that this is there's a tactile process to this. And that's part of the fun of it too. I mean, when you're doing macro photography, you're really involved.
Yeah.
You're just walking around shooting snapshots and holding up your phone. No, macro photography, you're there. You're in the moment. If you're really concentrating on what you're doing, you're really trying to get a very specific shot, you are really in the moment and you are taking photographs. Big difference.
Good point.
All right. Okay.
All right. Back to goofy lenses. I think the goofiest one of all. It's only $199. Okay, that's the Nikon Zongi 20mm f2.4. It's a 5x super macro. This is a goofy lens that just extends all the way out. It looks like one of these predator snails that just comes sliming out of its shell, grabs the thing, goes back in.
It's just
But
a long
does it-
extended.
It's a long. It's like
a Pinocchio nose,
Yeah, it's
right?
like a Pinocchio nose.
How funny.
Yeah, it's the goofiest looking thing. You know, it's really weird.
Hmm.
Anyway, it does not go to infinity like the Canon 65. It's 4.5 to 4x magnification. Gets down to 0.8 inches. That's right, and it's fully manual. A 3-blade diaphragm, cutting edge, and a metal lens barrel. And they make these for Sony A, Canon EF, Nikon, and Pentax K mounts. They're really novel. It's a lot of fun, and it's $200. Venus Optics also makes a Laowa, Laowa. That's a 60mm 2.8. This is a 2x ultra macro, and it's also $399 for a lens that will go down to twice life size. That's pretty darn good.
When you're saying 2x and 5x, it's 5 times. Two
Yeah,
times,
yeah,
just
yeah.
so
That's
people
the
get an idea what we're
magnification
talking
power,
about, yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So 1:1 is 1x. Yeah, right? Yeah.
Right.
And 2x would be twice life size. Really interesting lens. And again, not expensive. Lastly on this, we have the Yasuhara the Yasuhara Nanoha macro lens. That's a 5:1 from Micro Four Thirds, specific. It's $499. And again, made from Micro Four Thirds cameras, gives you 4:1 to 5:1 macro magnification. It has a removable 3 LED light source, and it has a focusing range of 11 to 19 millimeters. Period. You're not shooting horse races with this. And it comes with 4 plastic subject holders that hold whatever you're photographing in place because, again, it's ridiculous magnifications. So that's it for goofy lenses.
Going back to non-goofy lenses, macros generally cover the range from wide angle to about 200 millimeter, you said, right?
Yeah.
And what application-wise, what are you going to be using a wide angle macro for?
Okay. First, let's start off with a telephoto. If you've ever shot with a 50 or 60 millimeter or a normal macro lens, depending on whatever format you're using, a normal focal length, and you try to photograph something like a butterfly, it's gone before you even get a chance to focus because you're right on top of it. Right. Another thing is if you're shooting outdoors and the sun is out, quite often, depending on what you're photographing, your own shadow gets involved in it. Mm-hmm. So you get in real close and there you are and half the picture is in shadow and there's nothing you can do about that, your head, your camera, whatever. If you have a 105 or a 200 millimeter lens, you can now get back. Mm-hmm. Suddenly you're not spooking your subject. You have a narrower field of view, so you're not throwing your own shadow in. And they also go down to the same magnification. Yeah. Another advantage of a longer focal length, it's easier to isolate your subject. Again, a shooting at f8 with a 50 millimeter lens and shooting f8 with a 200 gives you different depth of field and spatial relationships. You could isolate your subject better with a longer lens. Mm-hmm. Now, conversely, I love shooting real close up with ultra wides, and I like getting in right on top of my subject, even if it's a pebble, and still be able to see everything in the surroundings, an environmental portrait of my macro subject.
Right.
And what's that going to do to the distortion? Is there going to be distortion?
You know, it depends on the lens. There are some lenses I've used, and depending, again, you can move in 1 or 2 millimeters closer, and suddenly you're distorting, and you pull back, and you're okay. But depending on the correction of the lens, aside from that goofy wide-angle spatial distortion, the objects themselves quite often, the subject, will come off pretty good.
Center.
Depending on the shape, and keep it in the center, put it on the edge, and all bets are off. Yeah. But, and again, it's also very tricky because your depth of field is nothing, and every little movement is just greatly magnified. So it depends on the visual application, just like you get different effects using wide-angle lenses for traditional photography. Same thing here using normal and telephoto.
So let's just talk kind of the general applications that we see this week. People shooting flowers, bugs, jewelry. What are you going to recommend? I mean, other than what you pointed out where you want to keep your shadow out, you want to keep the distance, I mean...
Okay, now you say
millimeter?
jewelry and other things. Now here's another thing, another dimension. Just even without going into macro photography, the choice of lenses determines how your subject is rendered. Now there's a reason why we use a 90 or a 105 millimeter lens for portraits, and that's because it renders faces well. There's a little bit of compression, and seems to be the most pleasing focal length to render a human face. Now, when you're doing products, you have to be careful of the same thing. Good example, I used to photograph boats a lot. And in my early days, when I first got my 20 and 15 millimeter lens, I went to town with it. And I would take pictures that were amazing to look at, but they couldn't use because I totally distorted the features of the boat and the boat itself. And I had to learn to use these wide-angle lenses properly, to aim them directly at the subject, how I'm tilting it. And it took a while to learn how to get the drama of a wide-angle lens without distorting my subject. So if you're going to be photographing, say, jewelry, if you shoot with a wider lens, it's going to bend it. It's going to make it. And the same thing if you may not, a 200 millimeter might compress it too much. If it's a gem, you might change the visual dimensions of it. So it's the same thing. You choose your lenses. It's
50
like
to
it's a
70,
brush.
somewhere in there, 50 to 65,
And another thing also for studio applications, one of the nice things about using a longer focal length macro is that if you are using lights, you could bring them in a lot tighter. And depending on the reflectance of your subject, it might make or break the picture. But again, longer focal length, narrower angle of view, and you're just peering through you could have two huge lights right next to your subject, and you're peeking between them. Whereas with a regular lens, you'd see the lights.
Right.
Okay.
I think we have a book here, huh?
Mark's rolling his eyes.
I know who to go to for the next edition.
Okay.
Well, tilt shift lenses, right?
Tilt shift lenses. Now, tilt shift lenses are available from Nikon, Canon, and some of the independent manufacturers. Now, some of them, not all of them, you have to check, do focus down to half life size. You know, there's the 45 millimeter, 85 millimeter focal lengths that we have that will go to half life size. Now, you also get tilt and shift controls with this. Now, we're talking about the depth of field, the narrow depth of field. What's interesting is that you can gain a lot of depth of field using these things without even having to stop your lens down. I remember I took a photograph there where there was a post, a fence post in the foreground of an old house, and it was about 9 inches away from the lens. And at wide aperture, I was shooting with a 17 millimeter Canon, I believe. They have a real ultra wide angle tilt shift. At wide aperture, I was able to focus on the post right in front of the lens and a small cottage about 60 feet past the house and the trees behind it, get it all in focus at wide aperture just by tilting it. So I was able to adjust the plane of focus. And then I stopped down 3 stops for reasons of resolution, and everything was in focus. So you could do some really neat tricks using these lenses with the close focusing and the tilt shift. Now, say you don't have macro lenses and you don't want to invest in them, but you still want to have fun. I strongly recommend you go to the used department of B&H. Okay, good starter place. We have a lot of bellows. Now, it used to be that every camera manufacturer made bellows systems to go along with it. You put the camera on one end, a lens on the other, and you now can focus ridiculously close, I think up to like 4 or 5 magnification, using any lens, all right? And you can use telephotos, wide angles to a limited extent, normal, whatever you want to do. There are many of them for sale, used in really, really clean condition for under $100. It's a great way to experiment. If you have a Nikon system, and if you could find, they made a whole series of them back over the years. And there was one model called the PB4, that's Peanut Butter -4. And what was neat about this bellows, and you could buy it for a few $100, they have tilt shift features on them. And also they made a 135 millimeter bellows lens that was dedicated that you could actually focus to infinity with it and do tilt shifting with. So there's a lot of neat stuff that you can get for not much money that gets you in real close and macro. Also, close-up lenses. They look like filters, except they're little magnifiers, and we sell them in all different price ranges. They're available from 27 millimeter through 138 millimeter. I'd love to know what lens that goes on. Also in different squares and in bayonet sizes, and Koken makes them as well. And they're available from like 0.05 to plus 10. And they could be stacked. And they're little magnifying lenses, and you could stack them up, and they let you focus closer. Now, do be aware that you do lose a little bit of sharpness with these things. Anytime you put anything in front of a lens, you pay for it. But it's a very inexpensive way to get very good pictures.
And have you had good experience? Because my experience when I add those kind of extensions has never been...
I've actually gotten some good shots. I really have, and I think it depends on the image itself. And I've used the same systems with good results and without good results. Again, it's the least expensive way of doing it. Now, a better way of doing that, if you don't want to lose optical quality, is to go into extension tubes, which come individually or in sets, and they're in fixed, usually they're like 10 or 11 millimeter and then a 16 and a 25 or whatever. And each of those, they allow you to use your existing lenses and focus that much closer without losing optical quality. That's the important thing.
Because they're just a tube.
It's just a hollow tube. Now, you do lose light if you're working with a completely manual camera system. You have to add exposure. If you're using the meter in the camera, you're fine. And again, if you could preview all this stuff and see if you're shooting digital.
But just to clarify, these attach between your lens and your camera body, extending the lens away from the plane.
Just like the bellows goes between the camera and the lens, same thing with an extension tube. You can hand-hold them. By the way, bellows, forget about hand-holding it. You can, but it's just
awkward.
It's like it's like holding a slinky. Right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like playing accordion while standing on a kayak. So that's it for all of the close-up options that I came up with. The last thing to talk about with on the topic.
Jump in real quick? What about this idea of putting your lens on backwards in reverse and putting a coupler?
Yeah, reversal rings.
Yeah.
That was actually my very first close-up system with my original Pentax H3V and 50 millimeter 1.8 Super Takumar lens with multi-coating.
How do you remember these things?
Good memory.
Okay. Yeah, I know. Ask me something serious and I'll stand here with my drooling. Yeah, if you take your lens, okay, and put it on the camera backwards, you can focus closer. It's really kind of goofy. They're called reversal rings, and one end is the thread mount or lens mount for your camera, and the other side is the thread mount of your lens. So if you have, say, a normal lens with a 52 millimeter front filter, you buy, if say you're shooting a Canon, a Canon 55 millimeter reversal ring, and you just like you screw a filter on, you screw the lens onto the camera body backwards. Now you do lose aperture. Depending on the camera and the lens, you do lose aperture control. So if in many cases you're going to be shooting at wide aperture only, which has its fun parts.
So it defaults to the widest aperture.
Defaults to, but it labels you to get into like an inch of whatever it is. And depending on the focal length and everything else, I can't give you an exact magnification, but it's getting right on top of your subject. Shallow depth of field. The edges can get a bit funky. And if you could stop your lens down, if you have a manual diaphragm system, you can stop it down for a little bit better image quality, but they're fun. And it's cheap and easy.
You know, that also goes back to what we were talking about as far as mountaineering. When you're trying to go light, that's a handy little thing you can just put in your backpack and
for fast and dirty close-ups.
Yeah.
Well, also the extension tubes. I mean, it couldn't get more basic than that. And
and by the way, there are different types. There is some you can buy for like for the price of a good lunch in Manhattan, cheap lunch in Manhattan at that point. They're not all expensive. Some of them are just hollow tubes. The more advanced ones will actually have contacts in them for all your data and all that stuff. Yep. Yeah. So you get all the benefits in all of your readouts. But I use them all, and again, they're all very good in their own way. So the last topic would be macro lighting. And while you can use a number of things, there are some really, really wonderful shoe-mounted, compact LED and flash systems. There are tiny ring lights that are available, a lot of very affordable, and some of them a little pricier, but they do amazing things where you could just slip them onto your camera, and what they do is they get the lights in real, real tight to your subject. Some of them you can actually model them, have one side stronger than the other. It enables you to evenly light your subjects at life size. Mm-hmm. So
well,
there you have it.
I mean, lighting is extra important when we're talking about macro. For the fact that you talked about you're often creating your own shadow over the image that you want to shoot, over the subject you want to shoot. And in general, you are so tight in, you need to get as much light in there as possible. So a ring light.
One of my favorite devices is a slip-on device that goes onto the hot shoe. That's where the batteries are. And it has two little goosenecks with round LED discs on it that are about 2 inches across. And I can get into life size. And I could just take these two things from the top of the camera, and they have about each of the goosenecks is about 1 foot long. And I just move these little lights around, and I light my subject up close. Of course, the camera's on a tripod.
Right.
Yeah.
But I could get in and light a tiny little thing with lights mounted on top of the camera. Right. And it was like $49.
Yeah, and
it's daylight balanced. It's beautiful.
I was going to ask you.
Daylight balanced.
Not bad.
Battery powered, and you could dim them and control them.
Can you turn
Don't
one
you love
off?
technology?
You can turn one
yes,
side on, one side off.
Yes,
to give a shadow.
all of this stuff. You could do all this modeling, and you can tweak it infinitely.
All right.
That's cool.
Get them closer, further, what different angles, and it's wonderful. It's really good.
Okay, so maybe just as a summary, what do people need to know when they're looking for this? Because obviously there's a range of focal lengths. Most manufacturers have variations on their macro, but if you really want macro, you need to look for 1:1. That's true macro.
Yes.
And what else do people look for if they're going to the site or any other? What should they think?
None of these lenses are fast. They're all the fastest macros. Actually, there's a 100 millimeter f2 from Zeiss, half-life size. I think it's their macro planar. Most of them are only about f2.8 to f4. They're not fast. But then again, they're not designed for speed.
Right.
And again, once you get in that close, if you were photographing at life size at at f1.4, you're literally dealing with like onion skin. There's nothing left there.
Right.
But I think the most important thing is to first determine what is it that you want to photograph. If you're going to be chasing insects and butterflies and wildlife, you want to tell a photo.
Get back to Mark over here, right?
There you go. Right, here we go. Mark, take it away.
The premise, the key to the whole thing is exactly what you said. It's the visualization process. What story are you trying to tell? What is it you have in mind? And then that drives what equipment you use.
Yeah.
And you really, that's true with any type of photograph, and certainly with macro. What do I want to come away with at the end of this thing? And you pick the equipment that will help you tell that story.
Yeah, you got to think of your lenses as paintbrushes. If you were a painter and you had brushes, okay, if you're doing a sky, all right, you're not using a 000 brush.
Right, exactly.
You're using a mop, okay? The same thing if you're doing a little detail.
Stipling it in.
You're not using a toothbrush.
Yeah.
So it's the whole thing. And I look at lenses the same way. My lenses are my brushes for my palette. And what am I saying? What do I want to do? How do I want to portray my subject? And it doesn't matter if you're dealing with something that is 2 inches away from the front of the lens or 200 feet or 2 miles away from the lens with a 600 millimeter lens.
Same process.
What are you trying to say? What do you want to walk away with? What do you want to have at the end of the day?
I want to have one of those shots of the bug's eyes that are like this, and you see the 10,000 eyes and the little hairs that are coming off them.
But I got to tell you, the most ambitious macro project I ever saw in my life was, and this is many years ago, I forgot what magazine it was in, somebody had an electron microscope, which gets down to ridiculous magnifications with great depth. It's almost 3D, okay? And they took insects and they put them to sleep with cold. All right, they basically put in like suspended animation. They froze them, semi-frozen, and they got them into focus, and they got everything set up, and then they let them thaw. And at a certain point, I forget which one they would start to come alive. And just as they started to rear their claws and stuff, whatever, okay, they come back, okay, they misted them with gold oxide. They gold-plated them, and then they photographed them with the electron microscope.
Process.
It was insane.
It actually reminds me, and I know this is about lenses specifically, but some cameras, point and shoots cameras, are offering microscopic macro.
That's
and
a really good
the
point.
TG Olympus tough cameras. you can basically place them lens down on the palm of your hand, and they have a LED ring.
Yes.
And you can photograph, your skin with the lens.
You're talking
right there.
about the TG3, 4, and
now 5.
And now 5.
Yeah.
It's a great little camera, a few $100s, has a 25 to 100 millimeter equivalent lens. You could drop it from 6 feet, go down 50 feet in the water with it, freeze it. I haven't thrown mine in the microwave yet, but it may or may not survive. Put a cup of water in with it. But what's cool about this thing is that you take off around the lens, there's a little disc that you take off, and then for like $30, we sell a little doodad that goes on, and it uses the camera flash through LEDs and surrounds the lens with a ring light, and it also kicks in an extra magnifier so you could photograph at like 8 magnification. I mean, really, it's crazy. It's really, really nuts. I mean, you can't fill look at your fingerprint and anything else. So it's ridiculously close up. But even without that, most point and shoot cameras do naturally focus close because the focal length lenses are like 3 millimeter and 4 millimeters, so they focus close anyway. So a lot of these cameras have close focusing modes that get in within millimeters of your subject. Now, they do distort much more than a full frame or APS-C, but at the same time, there's a few cameras. I know that Ricoh Pentax makes them, and there's a few other manufacturers. They actually built LEDs around the lens itself.
Yeah.
So that you put it into macro mode, it lights it right at the subject. It's shadowless, and it's perfectly exposed and daylight balanced for a few $100s.
Why not?
There are so many ways of getting involved in macro. There are so many ways.
Sounds good to me.
I'm exhausted. Yeah, Mark. So anyway, if people want to see your more of your work and see what you're doing and get where should they go? Tell them.
Okay, they should go to YouTube, and you can search for Marc Silber.
S-I-L. Oh, go ahead.
M-A-R-C. S-I-L. B as in boy. E-R. Marc Silber. You'll find my YouTube videos there. Same thing for Instagram at Marc Silber.
Okay.
Very handy. For Facebook, AYP Show, AYP Advancing Your Photography Show. You can find the book aypclub.com.
Okay. That's the easiest way. All right.
Easiest way to find it.
And you're in process to getting it in the B&H catalog, or?
As soon as I'm done here, we're going to meet with the buyer.
Okay.
Stay
good.
tuned.
Yeah.
See, there's something to live for.
Stay tuned.
The show's not over.
I'm sure
We're going to hang here.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. As mentioned earlier, this week is Macro Week at B&H Photo, and we have published a whole slew of articles. I did, I think, 2 articles. I wrote one about shooting macro photography using a Canon T6i with extension tubes, close-up lenses, and the basic lens. So it's the most basic entry-level macro stuff with easy consumer equipment, nothing fancy, and the kind of results I got. And I also did an article on close-ups with extreme wide-angle lenses, which is my own personal little form of sin. So at least I think there might have been another article. I'm not quite sure. John, you wrote anything for this week's?
I was doing the review of that 100 millimeter Rokinon macro.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not going to come out though.
All right.
We'll explain why later.
All right, we'll cut that.
But what I think is great though is something you hinted at earlier, which is that when you're doing macro, it changes the dynamics. You become almost like I don't know how to say it, an artisan, a scientist, someone you're playing, you're slowing down, you're adjusting, you're looking at your subject in a different way, you're adjusting your lens, your camera, your lights, and it's a different process than I think a lot of us are used to.
It's in the moment. It's totally in the moment.
Yeah, and it's easy to do with macro, with extension tubes, or you don't need to spend a lot of money to have a lot of fun.
And there's something neat about looking at things, even the most commonplace things, so close up in your face. I mean, you start seeing. And let's face it, that's what photography is about. It's about seeing.
It is.
Okay? Yeah, anybody could hold the phone up and take a picture down the street. Okay? And there are some fine pictures that have been taken that way. But man, if you could find the picture.
That's right.
Go find it and take something that nobody else has done before. That's when it gets cool. Anyway, Enough said. That's a wrap of another fine show. Thank you, Marc Silber. Again, Marc's new book is called Advancing Your Photography, and it's well worth reading. Check out past episodes on our landing page, and while you're there, leave us a voicemail on our SpeakPipe widget. Any thoughts or comments? We'd love to hear them. Our email address is podcast@bhphoto.com. On behalf of John Harris, Jason Tables, and myself, thank you so much for tuning in today.